Lost media. Something that's always been such an interesting topic because it goes back to this thing of nostalgia and memory that we thought was gone forever. But today we're going to do lost car media. We did this a little while ago and you seem to like it, so we're doing it one more time. So from rear-wheel drive neon-based sports cars to failure SUVs to a special McLaren F1, let's get right into it. The Dodge Viper. We all know the Dodge Viper as this incredibly sketchy, fantastic, dangerous, and incredible sports car from Dodge. Always manual, always V10, always rear-wheel drive. And as the legend goes, when they first came out, the bulk of them were crashed on the way home. So what's it doing here? Well, when Dodge was in production of the Gen 2 Dodge Viper, they wanted to kind of evolve it a little bit. So they made a one-off concept of a mid-engine Dodge Viper. I've talked about this in a previous video, go check it out if you want, but we're going to brush up on it one more time. So these are only two photos that exist of the mid-engine Dodge Viper. The goal for this was to have the Viper be a bit more competitive, a bit more track-focused, a bit more aggressive, and have that enormous engine being in the middle of the car. And despite they did get one complete version of the mid-engine Dodge Viper done, it had a bit of a problem. That engine is enormous. Despite stretching the back end of the Viper, they had huge space issues actually fitting it and the transmission in, almost to the point of it not being able to actually fit a passenger seat in there due to the transmission took up so much space. In addition to that, to produce this thing, it was going to cost almost $10 million more to actually get production ready for a mid-engine Dodge Viper. And despite Dodge was doing better at that point in time, they weren't doing that much better. So ultimately, Dodge scrapped the mid-engine Viper. Fortunately though, a lot of the engineers that were working on the mid-engine Viper for Dodge ended up going to Ford to help them with the Gen 1 Ford GT. So it didn't go to waste. Kind of. Despite the design spirit lived on in the Ford GT, what ended up happening with the Viper was, well, it got scrapped. Since there was no plans to bring it in production, all the parts from the mid-engine Viper were scrapped and that car no longer exists. Really unfortunate because it brings up the question of what could have been. Next up we have the Pantera. So through the course of the 1970s and 1980s, Di Tommaso made the Pantera. Kind of the Ford GT of the 1970s, an Italian supercar using a Ford 351 Cleveland and a 5-speed manual, and sounded like this. When Di Tommaso was working on their resurgence in 2010-2011, one of the first things they were working on was a Pantera. And somehow the only video I can find is actually in one of my old videos, which is this. That's the only video of this car that exists right now. Exact numbers on the Pantera are hard to come by, but what's speculated was it'd be using a Ford V8 making about 550 horsepower, keeping the concept of this new upcoming Pantera fairly true to the original. But what Di Tommaso out of the making was this. Nobody cared about it. The Di Tommaso brand flopped until the P71 came out. Amazing car. But what happened to the Pantera? Great question. Due to, any way you want to slice it, there's so little content of this. And when Di Tommaso was first come out, there really wasn't much in the way of hype for it. Nobody really knows what happened to the Pantera. The most likely scenario was it was either stripped for parts or it's sitting in a shed somewhere in Italy. Which is unfortunate because it would be so cool to have just one more generation of the Pantera in existence. Sticking with Ford V8s, we go to the Ford Mustang. In 2005, Ford brought out the S197 Mustang, a retro throwback Mustang which was inspired by the 1969 Mustang. Sold unbelievably well in its first year, and we ended up getting cars like the GT500 back from that. But Ford was poking out one more trim level of Mustang. I remember reading this digital test in either Motor Trend or Road & Track magazine from like 2007, and it was looking at this digital test of a 6-cylinder Mustang, a GT, a GT500, and a Boss 330 Mustang. I did a whole video on this last year, but for now I'm just going to give a quick rundown. The whole premise of the Boss 330 Mustang was to make a Mustang GT, but have it use a naturally aspirated version of the 5.4 engine. Now, Ford poked at this. There's enough data for that magazine company to use to do this digital test. This car had something going for it, but There is no mule car, there is no photos, there's only that digital text, which, as you've discovered so far, I can't find anymore. So what happened? Ford didn't start planning on bringing back the 5-liter until 2009. So this being 06, 07 when they would have been debating on doing this, it's not because the 5-liter was coming. It very well could have been, well, kind of too good. Because despite it would have been making as much power as its big brother, the GT500, it still would have been making decent power. Speculation number is somewhere around the 375 to 400 horsepower marker, which, since it also would have cost less than the GT500, it wouldn't have been that hard to tune it up to the GT500 power, and, well, at that point, why buy a GT500? But in reality, who knows? All that really exists of the Boss 330 Mustang is that one article that I cannot for the life of me find, and, well, that's it. The whole concept of lost media is something that was made or created in some form or another in which is lost. It was a concept in some form or another, but at this point in time is gone. Next up we go to Studebaker. Now in the early 2000s, Studebaker was trying to make a comeback, and one of the brands they were using for this was Avanti. Avanti is known for making sports cars which all look the exact same over like a 40-year history. But they wanted to make a vehicle in which was more appealing to the general public. And what they chose to do is make the Avanti XUV, the extreme utility vehicle. Originally shown off in 2003, this is going to be the ultimate SUV. Big, boxy, rugged, and using optional Ford 6.8-liter V10, a Ford Power Stroke, or a supercharged Ford 6.8-liter V10. But they had some problems. Despite this is going to be the thing that really brought Avanti and Studebaker back from the ashes, you may have already gathered it looks a lot like another vehicle. Another very, very popular vehicle. The Hummer H2. So needless to say, GM took Studebaker to court and forced them to change the Avanti styling. And Avanti obliged. The primary thing they changed was the windshield, sloping it more back so it wasn't quite as boxy as the Hummer H2. And despite they were willing to do these changes to make sure it came out into production, and what we saw was going to be the car that Avanti actually brought out, they got 0 requests for it. Not one order was taken for the XUV, which meant obviously Avanti never made it. And Avanti died in 2007, so almost didn't matter. But they built 2, the silver one and the orange one. What happened? That's where things get a little bit tricky, because there's 2 ideas towards what could have happened. One side people lean on is it was destroyed. Avanti was worth nothing at that point. They were just trying to get rid of things. Likely a lot of what they had was destroyed anyway, so these 2 concept cars that nobody wanted, it's believable. The other theory is they were moved off to Mexico. See, Avanti actually had headquarters in Cancun, Mexico in 2006, so it's not too unrealistic that these 2 would have been shuffled down to Cancun, Mexico, and are kind of just hiding down there collecting dust. So if some urban explorer wants to go travel around Cancun, Mexico to find these, it would be one hell of a car spotting. But as for now, that's all we know of the XUV. Next up, we go to Dodge. Now, in the 1990s, Mopar was coming back. They were actually making cool things. We got the Ram RT, the Grand Cherokee RT, the Prowler, the Viper. They were actually making interesting stuff. Now, one thing Dodge always wanted was another entry-level sports car, something that was kind of a more budget-friendly Dodge Viper. And they had a few attempts at this, but the first one they tried was the Dodge Venom. The Venom was going to be Dodge's comeback into making muscle cars. So having this car, the very Viper-inspired front end, the very Barracuda-styled rear end, it made for a nice recipe. On top of that, it was making about 245 horsepower, rear-wheel drive, manual option, and it was going to start at $9,000 in 1994 money. Any way you want to slice it, that sounds pretty good. And if you want to complain about 245 horsepower in 1994, that is more than a Ford Mustang was making. It's not too far off from what a Camaro Z28 was making. And in the grand scheme of things, cars like the Corvette and the Ferrari 348 weren't making that much more power. Here's where this thing gets a little bit weird. We knew it was using a 3.5-liter V6 that made 245 horsepower. Same engine that went into the Plymouth Prowler. But the car itself was weird. The front end of the car was actually used on the Chrysler Intrepid, and that's kind of where that went after this. but the body itself came from the Dodge Neon. It was a modified Dodge Neon chassis which was stretched out by 2 inches and converted to rear-wheel drive to hold this. And kind of one of the big things with this was, along with that additional 2 inches of wheelbase, it also used like 20-inch rims in the back, so they actually had the wheels pushed way back on this car, which actually led to a much larger interior than a lot of its competition. This thing was cool, and again, starting at $9,000 and a fully loaded price of $13,000. And unlike a lot of its competition, it did 2 full years of car show touring because it had a lot of interest. Unfortunately, the idea got canned. So why? It has interest, it'd be easy to build, all the pieces were there, why didn't it work? The exact reasoning towards why Chrysler eventually canceled this is a little unknown. Chrysler's never actually given a full reason towards why they didn't proceed with the Venom, but the idea was always there, because despite the Venom was canned in probably 1996, in 1997 Dodge brought out the Copperhead, which was kind of the same premise as the Venom. Rear-wheel drive, V6, entry-level Viper. And it got canned as well, and there wasn't really a replacement for this until 2008 for the Dodge Demon. Not that demon, this demon. This is also labeled as kind of an entry-level Viper, and it's going to be as a Miata competition, but recession didn't happen. As for the Dodge Venom, it hasn't been seen since the mid-90s, and we don't know where it is. It very well could have been chopped up and turned into a Chrysler Intrepid concept car, but we don't know. And the last one we're going to talk about is the McLaren F1. Yes, the McLaren F1 came out, we all know about it, it is not lost media. Chassis 39. To some of you, that means a lot. To some of you, that means absolutely nothing, but let's do a quick walk through it. So, McLaren F1 Chassis 39 was a brown McLaren F1 that had red seats and gold wheels. The person who bought this originally spec'd it out like this, brought it home, wife found it ugly, they sold it. Someone who bought it was El Chapo, so it spent most of its life in Mexico. After his arrest, car bounced around for a while, and there was the rare sightings of it in Mexico from the early 2000s. One of all of our favorite car YouTubers, Ed Bullion, tries multiple times to buy this, and it falls apart. What happened? Well, the last known sighting of it was in Mexico when the driver was actually assassinated, the car was stolen, and the person who stole the cars drove off, as you do when you steal a car. But McLaren F1 Chassis 39 has not been seen since then. This, for a little while, was one of the most famous McLaren F1s on the internet, mainly in part of VinWiki and Ed Bullion trying to track it down so he could buy it and have one of the kind of ugliest and worst spec McLaren F1s. But also, you could have the worst spec McLaren F1 and still say, hey, I got a McLaren F1, I'm better than you. But nonetheless, for the time being, McLaren F1 Chassis 39 is lost to the wind. So that is 6 cars in the realm of automotive lost media. But as always, I want to know, what do you think? Would you have bought a Dodge Venom when they first came out? Do you ever expect to hear anything of McLaren F1 Chassis 39 ever again? And if you like this video, would you want a part 3? Let me know in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. Like, subscribe, enjoy what you've seen. I tend to post a couple times a week, and I'll see you later.